return now to Chapter 9 of Ulysses for a second look. In the first lecture on this chapter, we considered why Stephen and Bloom each come to the National Library of Dublin at about 2 p.m., and why Stephen feels compelled to explain his theory of Shakespeare's Hamlet to a gathering of Dublin's literati, even though he has no wish to join the Irish literary revival. In this second lecture, I want to consider what Stephen's theory of Hamlet is, what it tells us about Stephen's quest for a literary father, and what it tells us about Stephen's conception of the creative artist. Let's start with Stephen's theory of Hamlet. For Stephen, Hamlet is really a play about Shakespeare's life. In other words, Stephen reads the play as disguised autobiography, a veiled reenactment of Shakespeare's own experience, or rather, Stephen's version of that experience. For Stephen's account of Shakespeare's life is personal, subjective, and idiosyncratic, and tells us more about Stephen himself than about Shakespeare. In seeking to unmask the playwright who stands behind the play, Stephen is also seeking a literary father, someone to help him fulfill his own literary ambitions. Stephen thinks he can find that father in Shakespeare, and that he can find Shakespeare in the ghost of old King Hamlet. In taking the ghost as the key to the whole play, Stephen does something that is at once original and personal. He turns away from the title figure, the young prince, the tormented son, the melancholy dreamer, the philosophic speculator who has fascinated so many critics of the play and who has sometimes been identified with Shakespeare himself. Stephen turns away from this tormented son to focus on the tormented father, the ghost burning in purgatory for his sins, the ghost burning with rage at the man who has taken his life, his wife, and his throne. As the son of a ghostly mother who has recently come to him in a dream, Stephen is riveted by the scene in which the ghost of old King Hamlet appears to his son. But how can he identify the ghost with Shakespeare if Shakespeare was alive to write the play? Stephen anticipates this question. What is a ghost, he asks? One who has faded into impalpability through death, through absence, through change of manners, as Stephen says. Shakespeare left his wife in Stratford while he lived and worked in London for 20 years. Thus he became a ghost by absence. To his wife and children, he was only a memory, as if he had died. On the strength of this would-be biographical fact, which is of course really just a piece of speculation, Stephen builds his argument that the ghost in Hamlet represents Shakespeare. He launches his argument by telling a story just as rich in specific detail as his earlier story of the old Dublin ladies climbing Nelson's pillar. As he starts to tell the story, he says to himself, local color, work in all you know. And then, composition of place, Ignatius Loyola, make haste to help me. St. Ignatius of Loyola, a Spanish priest who founded the Jesuit order in 1540, published in 1548 a book called Spiritual Exercises. And in this book he explained how to meditate by starting with a specific place, by imagining just how, let us say, just how the scene of the crucifixion might have looked. Now, Stephen was trained by Jesuits, as I was myself, and even though he has renounced his faith in the Catholic Church, the Jesuits have nurtured his imagination. So here he uses it to create a verbal picture of Shakespeare's play Hamlet on stage in early 17th century London. On stage at the Globe Playhouse on the bank of the River Thames in the early afternoon of a day in mid-June, with the role of the ghost played by Shakespeare, who was in fact an actor as well as a playwright. You see, while other critics see Shakespeare as the international genius of Platonic ideals and formless spiritual essences, Stephen wants to repatriate Shakespeare. He wants to put him back on the ground in England, in London, in the playhouse by the riverbank, to situate him in a particular place and time, to recover him as a human being caught up in a painful set of family relations like the old King Hamlet played by Shakespeare himself. The play begins, says Stephen to his audience. The play begins. A player comes on under the shadow. made up in the cast-off male of a court buck, a well-set man with a bass voice. It is the ghost, the king, and no king, and the player is Shakespeare, who has studied Hamlet all the years of his life in order to play the part of the spectre. He speaks the word to Burbage, the young player who stands before him beyond the rack of cerecloth, calling him by a name. Hamlet, I am thy father's spirit. To a son he speaks, the son of his soul, the prince, young Hamlet, and to the son of his body, Hamnet Shakespeare, who has died in Stratford that his namesake may live forever. Let's talk about this passage. Stephen imagines that in the very first production of Hamlet, Shakespeare is himself playing the ghost. In that role, says Stephen, the playwright speaks to his fellow actor, Richard Burbage, the first man who ever played the prince. In speaking to Burbage as Hamlet, Shakespeare speaks to the son of his soul, that is, to the character that he has created in his play. But he also speaks to the son of his body, a boy named Hamnet, who died in Stratford at the age of 11 in 1596. The last point is a well-established fact, and Shakespeare certainly could have played the ghost in the first production of Hamlet. Putting the fact and the possibility together, Stephen takes Prince Hamlet as the dramatized version of Shakespeare's son, the dramatized version of what Shakespeare's little boy Hamnet might have grown up to be. And Stephen has already argued that Shakespeare's long separation from home and wife has made him a ghost by absence. Consequently, when the ghost tells the prince that Claudius murdered him for his wife and his throne, Stephen imagines that Shakespeare is saying to Hamnet, you are the dispossessed son. I am the murdered father. Your mother is the guilty queen, and Shakespeare, born Hathaway. Of course, Stephen is stretching the facts here, wildly stretching the facts. He's asking us to assume that Shakespeare's deliberate absence from Stratford makes him somehow a victim of murder, that his already dead son has been posthumously disinherited, and, most problematic of all, that his wife has committed adultery during his absence. This is truly a wild hypothesis, so wild that Stephen himself has trouble swallowing it. His self-doubts emerge in moments of silent self-questioning that periodically break up his long speeches. At one point, he stops talking out loud for a moment to interrogate himself silently. What the hell are you driving at? I know. Shut up. Blast you. I have reasons. Are you condemned to do this? Stephen doesn't answer his own final question, but by now we know him well enough to guess the answer. He has condemned himself to do this because he desperately wants to know what it means to take a wife and father a son. This question leads him not only to Shakespeare, but to a Shakespeare who looks very much like Ulysses on the one hand and Bloom on the other. For even though Stephen is scarcely aware of these resemblances, his version of Shakespeare's life enables us to see them. Think about the connections. Think about the parallels. Like Ulysses, Stephen Shakespeare spends 20 years away from home and comes back at the end of his life. Bloom leaves Molly for no more than a long day, but he too returns. In other words, each of these wanderers finally comes back to his home and his wife. Secondly, all three wanderers suspect their wives of infidelity during their absence. We already know about Bloom. We will shortly consider what Stephen says about Shakespeare's suspicions of Anne. And when Ulysses comes home, he finds a house full of men pressing his wife to remarry, and he won't reveal himself to her until he has tested her fidelity to him. Still more parallels emerge when we focus on just Bloom and Shakespeare, by which I mean Shakespeare as Stephen presents him. By the time Shakespeare wrote Hamlet, his son had died at the age of 11 years. Bloom's son died at the age of 11 days. According to Stephen, the author of Hamlet had not only an adulterous wife, but also a dead father and a living daughter, just like Bloom. Also, think about Shakespeare playing the ghost and speaking to Hamlet, the son of his soul, the grown-up version of his dead son. When Shakespeare speaks to this grown-up version of his dead son Hamnet, he reminds us again of Bloom's tendency to think of Stephen as the grown-up version of little dead Rudy. Back in chapter 6, when Bloom catches sight of Stephen en route to the cemetery, he thinks about what little Rudy might have become. And if Stephen stands, in any sense, for the young man that Rudy might have become, he is also something of a Hamlet, as we've already seen, wearing black and brooding over the ghost of a dead parent. So now you see the parallels between Shakespeare, Ulysses, and Bloom. In Shakespeare's play, Hamlet tells a group of players that the chief purpose of a play is to hold up a mirror to nature. As Stephen interprets him, the ghost of old King Hamlet mirrors the life of Shakespeare, the life of Ulysses, and the life of Bloom, who in a way has already begun to play the ghost before chapter 9 even begins. Near the beginning of chapter 8, when he's watching the gulls floating on the Liffey, Bloom gets to thinking about poetry, and he quotes to himself the very first line spoken by the ghost of old Hamlet. Hamlet, I am thy father's spirit, doomed for a certain time to walk the earth. For the record, I should say that Bloom and Stephen both misquote the first line here, which is simply, I am thy father's spirit, not Hamlet, I am thy father's spirit. But the real point is that both Bloom and Stephen think about Hamlet today. Yet another point of convergence between them. Also, in quoting, or even misquoting, the words of the ghost, Bloom helps us to realize that he himself can be linked to the ghost, and through the ghost to Shakespeare, the literary father that Stephen seeks. Stephen seeks Shakespeare in all of his works. Having raised the curtain of his argument by describing the ghost scene from Hamlet, he seeks a clue to Shakespeare's early life in one of his early works, a narrative poem called Venus and Adonis. Stephen reads this poem as a mythologized version of Shakespeare's affair with Anne Hathaway, which led to her pregnancy and their hasty marriage. Many people believe, in the words of Eglinton, quote, that Shakespeare made a mistake and got out of it as quickly and as best as he could, unquote. But Stephen insists that a man of genius makes no mistakes. His errors are volitional and are the portals of discovery. Very well. How does Shakespeare's error with Anne lead him to compose Venus and Adonis? Well, this poem tells how Venus, a goddess of love, falls in love with a handsome young man named Adonis. In spite of her captivating charms, he insists on going hunting, as men will, and ends up getting fatally gored by a boar. Okay, you ask, where do we find Anne and Will in this story? Well, since Anne was 26 and Will was 18 when she conceived his child, Stephen argues that Venus and Adonis tells in disguised form the story of how she seduced him. If others have their will, he says, Anne hath a way. The gray-eyed goddess who bends over the boy Adonis, stooping to conquer, as prologue to the swelling act, is a bold-faced Stratford wench who tumbles in a cornfield a lover younger than herself. In thus seducing Shakespeare, Stephen says, she unmanned him, left him sexually gored, sexually traumatized. For evidence, Stephen points to the dark lady of Shakespeare's sonnets, a lady who supposedly rejected him when he sent his friend William Herbert to woo her for him. If this story is true, Stephen wonders why such a lord of language would possibly need another to speak for him. Why, Stephen asks? Belief in himself has been untimely killed. He was overborn in a cornfield, or rye field, first, and he will never be a victor in his own eyes. He will never be a victor in his own eyes after, nor play victoriously the game of laugh and lie down. No later undoing will undo the first undoing. The tusk of the boar has wounded him there where love lies a-bleeding. Poor bloody Will. But how could we square this picture of a sexually victimized young man with the hugely successful playwright he became, or with his sexual exploits in London, away from Anne? 20 years he dallied there, says Stephen. 20 years he dallied between conjugal love and its chaste delights, and scortatory love and its foul pleasures. Once, says Stephen, Shakespeare overheard a woman asking Richard Burbage to come to her after she'd seen him play Richard III, So Shakespeare got to her first. And when Burbage came knocking, Will cried out, "William the Conqueror came before Richard III." Does this sound like a sexually victimized man or an irrepressible playboy? It sounds like a playboy, of course. But before we conclude that Shakespeare was simply a playboy, let's remember an epic hero who spent 20 years away from his wife, tomcatting around the Mediterranean, bedding down for one whole year with a lovely enchantress, and then for 7 years with a beautiful nymph. Yeah, that's Ulysses I'm talking about. And Ulysses, you remember, comes home at last to find his house usurped and his wife harassed by suitors whom he eventually slaughters. In other words, the philandering of this wandering husband hardly precludes his getting outraged by the infidelity of his wife or even by threats to that fidelity. The double standard has been around a very long time. Now, Stephen isn't talking about Ulysses. He's reading Shakespeare's work as the mirror of his life. But the story he's telling about that life makes Shakespeare sound like yet another long-absent husband who doesn't fully trust his wife, or in this case, believes that she has cheated on him. Take, for instance, Shakespeare's will, where he leaves her his second-best bed. This could well be a token of affection for Anne, something beyond what she would inherit automatically by common law. But because second best sounds on the face of it like a slight, Stephen takes it as evidence that Shakespeare thought Anne unworthy of his best bed. Here, of course, Stephen grinds the facts to fit his theory, and he finds more grist for his mill in the names of two of Shakespeare's three brothers, Richard and Edmund. As Stephen rightly says, Shakespeare gives those names to two of his greatest villains. Richard III woos and wins a widow named Anne, of all things, and in King Lear, Edmund the Bastard usurps the legitimate rank of his brother Edgar. With Edmund and Richard and Claudius, the usurping brother of old King Hamlet, you've got more than enough grist for Stephen's theory that Shakespeare thought his wife had been seduced by one or both of his brothers during his long stay in London. Consequently, Stephen finds one theme dominating Shakespeare's work. The theme of the false, or the usurping, or the adulterous brother, or all three is one to Shakespeare. What the poor are not. The theme of the false, or usurping, or the adulterous brother, or all three in one, is to Shakespeare what the poor are not, always with him. The note of banishment, banishment from the heart, banishment from home, sounds uninterruptedly from the two gentlemen of Verona onward till Prospero breaks his staff. It is in infinite variety everywhere in the world he has created, in Much Ado About Nothing, twice in As You Like It, in The Tempest, in Hamlet, in Measure for Measure, and in all the other plays which I have not read. Stephen punctuates this speech with a laugh, knowing that he has blown his theory up like a balloon until it pops. Shortly afterwards, when Eglinton asks him if he believes the theory, Stephen frankly and promptly says, no. But here he comes closest to revealing his own hidden agenda. Here he all but tells us why he so desperately seeks to show that the ghost in Hamlet is Shakespeare himself. Shakespeare struggling with the pain of usurpation and banishment. Stephen's theory is an exercise in self-revelation. What he says about Shakespeare is what he wants and needs to believe about his own life and his mission in life. As one student of mine observed, Stephen goes to Shakespeare, his literary father. Stephen goes to Shakespeare to get permission to create from his own sense of banishment and to get permission to create his art from his own sense of banishment and usurpation. Stephen is banished, or self-banished, from his father's home, and from the Martello Tower, the tower for which Mulligan holds, from the Martello Tower, the tower for which Mulligan holds the key. He cannot go home, and yet he must somehow work out his relation to home, to his family, his religion, his country. He must negotiate the relation between himself as an artist and the outside world. He must find a way between the Charybdis of self-absorption and the Scylla of mere facts about his native city of Dublin, the sort of facts that get chewed up and spewed out by newspapers. Shakespeare is Stephen's model for this kind of negotiation. As Stephen says, he found in the world without as actual what was in his world within as possible. Every life is many days, day after day. We walk through ourselves, meeting robbers, ghosts, giants, old men, young men, wives, widows, brothers in love, but always meeting ourselves. This is Aristotle reconfigured by Joyce. As S.L. Goldberg suggests, Stephen uses both Shakespeare and Aristotle here to help him define the soul. Aristotle distinguishes between potentiality and actuality. What could happen and what is made to happen, actualized, realized for us to see and hear and touch. For Stephen, the soul is a potentiality that actualizes itself through experience, which is why, in meeting others, we walk through ourselves. Stephen not only recognizes himself in Shakespeare, he sees in Shakespeare an artist who fused the subjective life with the objective world. As Stephen sees him, Shakespeare neither lost himself in a whirlpool of subjectivity nor turned his art into the rock of hard, objective facts, into the Scylla of pure objectivity. Instead, he found his way between these two perils by making his art a vitally humanized mirror of life. While representing the outside world in all its color and life and variety, he poured his spirit into all the reflections of that world that he sets before us. His art reflects both himself and the world. In Shakespeare's work, and most especially in Hamlet, this fusion of the subjective and objective is best exemplified by the relation between the father and the son. In Hamlet, according to Stephen, Shakespeare represents the objective facts of his own life, of his own situation as a father. But he also projects himself as the spiritual father of all his race, including, of course, all the writers who would follow him. When Shakespeare wrote Hamlet, Stephen says, he was not the father of his own son merely, but being no more a son, he was and felt himself the father of all his race, the father of his own grandfather, the father of his unborn grandson. In the Shakespeare thus defined by Stephen, we can once again recognize Stephen himself, the artist who burns to father a race of his own, to forge in the smithy of his soul the uncreated conscience of his race. But there's a further complication here that we have to talk about. In spite of Stephen's grand pronouncement, and in spite of the passion with which he seeks his literary father in Shakespeare, he nonetheless makes us wonder just how far paternity can serve as a metaphor for literary creation. This is the final twist in the long, snaky line of Stephen's argument. It's a twist that recalls a remarkable passage in the first book of Homer's Odyssey, when the goddess Athena asks Telemachus if he is the son of Ulysses. In Richmond Lattimore's translation, Telemachus answers, "My mother says, indeed, I am his son. I, for my part, do not know. Nobody really knows his own father." Nobody really knows his own father. An extraordinary statement, echoed at one point in this chapter by Stephen. Since no man consciously begets a child, Stephen says that fatherhood is a mystical estate, that paternity may be a legal fiction, and that motherhood may be the only true thing in life. Let's remember, too, what comes to Stephen's mind back in chapter 2 as he talks to Cyril Sargent, the snail-like schoolboy who comes to him for help with his algebra. Sargent's vulnerability reminds him of his own childhood and of his dependence on a mother who nourished and protected him from a world that would otherwise have trampled him underfoot, a squashed, boneless snail. If children cannot survive without their mothers, if motherhood may be the only true thing in life, what should we say about a theory of literary creation based solely on fatherhood? For this question, Buck Mulligan has a typically irreverent answer. When Stephen claims that Shakespeare fathered all of his race, Mulligan concludes that Shakespeare must have fathered himself. Then he says, "Wait, I am big with child. I have an unborn child in me brain. Pallas, Athena, a play, the play's the thing. Let me parturiate. Mulligan pretends to be pregnant, like the Greek god Zeus, who made Athena, goddess of wisdom, spring right out of his head. Mulligan listens while Stephen talks about a heaven foretold by Hamlet and the Gospel of Matthew, a heaven where there are no more marriages, glorified man, an androgynous angel, being a wife unto himself. Hearing this, Mulligan cries, "Eureka!" and begins to write a play about masturbation. Every man his own wife, or a honeymoon in the hand, a national immorality in 3 orgasms. We could say, of course, that Mulligan totally misses the point of Stephen's argument about Shakespeare, which in fact he has heard only in part since he arrived in the middle of it. But for all his irreverence, Mulligan here exposes the absurdity of purely male begetting, of a man giving birth without the aid of a woman. Stephen's theory of literary creation cannot be complete until it makes room for women, which is one reason why we have yet ahead of us in this novel 2 chapters on the role of women in the regeneration of life, a chapter about childbirth and a chapter about Molly Bloom, the culminating affirmation of life in this book. In the meantime, we should note one other thing that Stephen says of himself near the end of this chapter. Though in many ways he seeks and finds a literary father in Shakespeare, he has hardly forgotten that his name is Daedalus, that his mythical father is a fabulous artificer who made a pair of wings for himself and his son Icarus. This consciousness of his mythical ancestry makes him yearn to fly, as we have already seen. But even as he yearns to fly into glory as a writer, he must recognize how little he has flown so far. Ruefully remembering at one point his trip to Paris, Stephen says to himself, "You flew. Where to? New Haven, Dieppe. Steerage passenger. Paris and back. Lapwing. Icarus. Pater. Ayat. Sea-bedabbled. Fallen. Weltering. Lapwing you are. Lapwing he." Once again, Stephen likens himself to the doomed son of Daedalus in the story told by the ancient Roman poet Ovid. When Daedalus and his son flee the island of Crete with their newly made wings, Icarus flies so close to the sun that it melts the wax holding the wings to his body, and he falls into the sea and drowns, crying for his father. Pater ayet means father he called. A lapwing is a newly hatched bird, and in Hamlet the term is contemptuously applied to a foppish courtier named Osric. So Stephen is silently calling himself a doomed little bird, a fledgling who flew to Paris in quest of literary glory, but has now come home to drown in futility and drink. A little later, in fact, Mulligan gleefully reminds Stephen of a night at the theater when he ended up lying in his own mulberry-colored, multicolored, multitudinous vomit. But this image of Stephen as a lapwing doomed to drown and drink in his own vomit has to be set beside a rival image. Shortly after Stephen thinks of himself as a doomed lapwing, Mulligan says to him, "Come, wandering Angus of the birds." Angus is a figure out of Celtic myth, not Greco-Roman, but Celtic, Old Irish. Angus was the Irish god of youth, beauty, and love, something like the classical Apollo, except that he's strongly linked to birds. Birds of inspiration fly around his head while he wanders in search of his ideal mate, whom he saw in a dream. And in some versions, he discovers her as a swan, turns himself into a swan, and flies away with her. So when Mulligan calls Stephen Wandering Angus of the Birds, he sets going a train of associations in Stephen's head. Just a few lines from the end of the chapter, Stephen remembers that he dreamt of flying the night before, and also of a man who held out to him a cream fruit melon. This mental picture of the man with the melon flashes across his mind, Stephen's mind, at the very moment when Leopold Bloom is passing out of the library between him and Mulligan. Coincidentally, Bloom thought about melon fields earlier in the day. In chapter 4, when he read the ad about a Zionist plan to buy desert land from the Turkish government and make it fruitful. So what does this mean or suggest? If Stephen is anything like the wandering Angus who dreamed of his ideal mate and then set out to find her, the man with the melon that Stephen saw in his dream may have something to do with Leopold Bloom as the possible answer to Stephen's quest for a literary father. Stephen has sought a father in Shakespeare, but we have seen that Shakespeare's life, a life of estrangement from his wife and home, a life of wandering that ends in return, that Shakespeare's life looks in many ways like the lives of Ulysses and Leopold Bloom. To realize his literary ambitions, Stephen must avoid the Charybdian whirlpool of self-absorption and the Scylla of mere fact. Instead of drowning in drink or losing himself in Russell's formless spiritual essences, he must find himself in others, find the inspiration for his art in the life of Dublin and its wandering Jewish hero, Leopold Bloom.